Hello everyone, I'm Mike Connors, and welcome to How It Ticks, the go-to podcast for anyone with a spark of curiosity about the inner workings of Switzerland. Hosted by yours truly, an Australian expat with a deep curiosity, How It Ticks offers a platform where listeners are invited to explore the vast landscape of Swiss culture, business, innovation, and tradition. Each episode features a one-on-one interview with experts and thought leaders from various fields, providing a panoramic view of what makes Switzerland tick. If you are like me and you enjoy listening to successful people share their insights, this podcast is for you. How does a small country like Switzerland punch above its weight on the global stage? How does it adapt to a rapidly shifting world order? How can so many countries have so much debt and the approach from governments is just to print more money? How does this debt ever get repaid? In this episode, I sit down with Stefan Legge, Vice Director and Head of Tax and Trade Policy at the University of St. Gallen, to unpack the current macroeconomic environment and how Switzerland is navigating it. We explore Switzerland's intricate trade relationships, from free trade agreements with global giants like China and India, and Switzerland's trade relationship with the US and how it could be impacted if the Trump administration goes ahead with the tariffs they have committed to. We talk about government debt, comparing Switzerland's disciplined approach to the more precarious situations in Greece and Italy. Stefan shares insights on how debt impacts economic stability, the role of central banks, and the consequences of rising global debt levels. We also tackle bold economic experiments, including Argentina's radical government reduction ongoing at the moment, and Elon Musk's ideas for the US. How does this impact Switzerland, and could Switzerland learn from these and also benefit from a government reduction? Stefan offers a balanced view on the potential and also the limitations. To close, I threw a curveball and asked Stefan his thoughts on Bitcoin as a store of value and its place in the world of economics. His answer might surprise you. I can't imagine there are many people more informed and more well-spoken than Stefan when it comes to international trade and Switzerland's role in it. Enjoy. I thought an interesting place to start is Switzerland's trade relationships and where we are today, especially with a lot of the news regarding the US. But before asking you anything specific, can you first define for me what is a trade relationship and what are the different types of trade relationships that countries can have with each other?
Yes, sure. And the first thing you probably want to know is that pretty much every country in the world is a member of the World Trade Organization that was founded in 1995 as a successor to what was known as GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. All you have to know about that is that pretty much every country in the world has signed up to an international trading system. And in that trading system, there's a principle that's called most favored nation, which means that any preference Switzerland or any other country gives to another country has to be given to all countries. In other words, if Switzerland imports something from Germany and we say, well, T-shirts or cars from Germany are duty-free, there's no import tax, then that has to apply to all other countries. So in principle, all countries of the world, if they have no additional agreements, trade on that basis. Now, the relationship can be better, and the relationship is better if you have a bilateral trade agreement, a free trade agreement. That means, for example, Switzerland with the European Union or with China or many other countries, we have signed a treaty that says, well, we actually favor you. So imports from China, for example, are duty-free, whereas from the United States, they might not be duty-free. So this is a free trade agreement. It doesn't mean that all imports are free of tariffs, but usually most of the imports are then freed of any tariffs. And you can go beyond that. The trading relationship with the European Union, of course, is a lot more than just a free trade agreement. We have many other additional agreements that facilitate international trade between the European Union and Switzerland. So, for example, the mutual recognition of standards or free movement of people or any other additional access to the market of the other country. And so if you want to go beyond that, then you have something like a common market, as you see in the European Union. And eventually you might have something even closer when you have a common currency. So to put it into a nutshell, all countries of the world can trade with each other, but you have additional agreements that facilitate the international trading relationship.
What goes into a free trade agreement? Who is involved besides the two countries wanting the change in trade?
Well, that depends if it's a bilateral trading relationship or bilateral free trade agreement. Then it's the two parties. Of course, Switzerland often signs free trade agreements with what is called EFTA. That is including Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So we sometimes do that as a group. But then, it's the two countries sitting down and figuring out what concessions they want from each other and what they grant. The starting point is usually on international trade regarding tariffs. Which tariffs is Switzerland willing to cut or completely abolish on which product? So you really go through product by product. So for Switzerland, it's typically very important that when we sign a free trade agreement, we have very good access to the foreign market for the product that we actually sell or that we want to sell to the foreign market. And of course, the other country will ask Switzerland to lower tariffs on products that they want to sell. And then, for many products, there's not much of a dispute because countries have different strengths. But sometimes we currently negotiate with what is called Mercosur, countries in South America, like Brazil. They want to export agricultural products to Switzerland. And of course, here in Switzerland, not everyone is in favor of agricultural imports. And that means one party might ask for a concession that Switzerland is then not willing to grant. So the starting point is the reduction of tariffs. But over the last 10, 20 years, increasingly, bilateral trade agreements are about more than just the reduction of tariffs. That is partially because tariffs are already very low. And in the case of Switzerland, starting in this year, all tariffs on industrial products have been abolished, no matter where they come from.
But so I understand it would be between those two parties, but in reality, what other influences are there? So say if Switzerland today decided they want to enter a free trade agreement with Russia, as an extreme example, I'm sure there would be other parties involved wanting to get in between this agreement. No, like the US, the EU.
That could happen, although usually that doesn't play a big role. Of course, a very controversial trade agreement. So if Switzerland were to sign or negotiate a free trade agreement with Russia, that would, of course, probably trigger a response from other countries. But usually that's not so much the case. The other parties that are involved are, of course, businesses and business associations. They have a key interest. And when Switzerland, for example, signed the free trade agreement with India, that Switzerland gets India to make concessions, which are particularly important for a particular industry. But other countries are usually not involved. That could, however, change. You already mentioned that Switzerland has a free trade agreement with China. And of course, to the extent that with the new Trump administration, there might be an attempt to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States, but then the United States might ask about our free trade agreement with China. So that could happen, but usually it doesn't play a big.
What is the significance of a free trade agreement? Say, take I think it's the most recent one with India. Like, what is the expected change when a new agreement like India happens?
Yeah, that's a big question. How significant are these free trade agreements? The literature says, the effect can be very small or very big. And that's pretty much the result you get if you look at what's actually in that agreement. Now, give you a few examples. Switzerland has a free trade agreement with Canada. But if you look at what we actually trade with Canada, and you look at what is in the trade agreement, you would probably conclude that agreement doesn't have much of an impact. We would pretty much see more or less the same trade between the two countries if it hadn't been for this free trade agreement. There are other trade agreements which are more significant. Obviously, the one that Switzerland has with the European Union. Obviously, the one that we have with China. That is significant only because it's such an important trading partner, and we're exporting goods which otherwise would be subject to very significant tariffs. So the importance of free trade agreement varies from almost irrelevant to very significant. The one you mentioned with India, well, we have to see. I think it's mostly a free trade agreement that is focusing on the future. India right now is not that important of a trading partner for Switzerland. But if you look at India over the next 10, 15, 20 years, currently it has a GDP, the size of the economy, of about $4 trillion. That's about the size of Japan. It won't take long, and India will overtake Japan. It will overtake Germany, and then it will be the third largest economy in the world. And of course, when India reaches that level, it will probably be more difficult for Switzerland to sign a trade agreement. So it's a good idea to sign a trade agreement, even if for the next 3, 4, 5 years, the impact might be small, because eventually, hopefully in 10, 15 years, when the Indian economy is larger, Switzerland will be in a prime position to have a favorable access to that market. So the benefit might come over time. Also because some of the reductions in tariffs might be such that they only are implemented over time.
I can understand why Switzerland would benefit from importing a lot from other countries, given we're small, landlocked, doesn't have any natural resources. What are the big exports of Switzerland which other countries desire?
Well, to look at the statistics for Switzerland, it's actually quite diversified. It's and it contains a lot of surprising products. Like, what is Switzerland exporting? Obviously, the most important good by far are pharmaceutical products. But then, what else is there? Watches are very significant. Then you have machines, all kinds of precision instruments. Switzerland is very strong, just like Germany and Austria, very strong in the B2B, business to business sector. So these are products that you and I will probably never know, never see. But they are very important to produce the products that you and I buy. And, these machines are an important part of Swiss exports. And then you have many of the surprising things. Do you know that Red Bull is only produced in Austria and Switzerland? So the whole world is supplied with Red Bull, but just from 2 countries, one of which is Switzerland. Do you know that the most important agricultural export of Switzerland is coffee? It's not chocolate, it's not cheese, it's coffee. And why is that? Because, well, we import pretty much raw coffee, roast it, grind it, put it into little aluminum capsules, and sell them to the rest of the world at very high prices. And so what does Switzerland export? Well, quite a lot. It's very diversified. And in addition to the big ones that everyone probably knows, there's a lot of smaller ones, but they add up, especially for a country that only has 9 million people.
Yeah, I guess when I think about exports, I think of agriculture, natural resources, but perhaps that's just because I come from Australia. My imagination's a bit narrow. Does Switzerland have a free trade agreement with the US?
No.
Why is that?
Well, probably because the United States has very few trade agreements to begin with. It's a very large country. It's the biggest economy of the world. It has a trade agreement with its neighbors, Mexico and Canada, since 1994. But other than that, there are very few free trade agreements that the United States has ever signed. And so Switzerland has tried a couple of times to sign a free trade agreement, but it never got through. And the most recent attempt was during the first Trump administration, when the ambassador to Switzerland, Ed McMullen, actually really wanted to have Switzerland and the United States to sign a free trade agreement. But in his own words, COVID happened. And so then the focus shifted. Although anyone involved in the talks probably would say that there were other issues as well that prevented signing a free trade agreement.
Mm. Speaking of Trump, what do you think the impact would be to Switzerland or the EU if he goes ahead and implements these tariffs as he's been talking about the last 6 months?
Well, it's hard to say because we don't know yet what exactly he will do. Whether he will announce these tariffs as a way to sort of negotiate whatever kind of deals he wants to see, or whether he will just outright implement the tariffs. The important thing about tariffs is that they're actually not that damaging because it's like a tax on imports. And it basically means that companies like companies here in Switzerland that export to the United States, if their products become subject to the tariff, the question is, are they still the best source for these products, even if there's a 10% tax on that? And for the most part, the answer is yes. So the American consumers will simply pay more for the goods and services. However, the question is, can Swiss companies pass on the entire tariff in the form of higher prices to the American consumers? So if right now we sell a pharmaceutical product for 100 Swiss franc to the United States and there is no tariff, and then Trump imposes a 10% tariff, can we sell the whole thing for 110? If so, if we have that pricing power, it's basically a tax on American consumers. And to my knowledge, for the most part, if you look at Swiss exports, because Switzerland is such a rich country and because we're so specialized in products for which there is hardly any good alternative or comparable alternative in the world, Swiss companies usually have a lot of pricing power. And so I wouldn't be too worried about it. Of course, if the tariff is not 10%, but 100%, it's a different story. And so we have to still wait what Donald Trump really wants to accomplish. Right now, he's threatening these tariffs, but at the end of the day, Donald Trump is a very transactional person. He wants to make the next deal. And we have to see how he will actually behave once he's in office.
As you were talking, I also just thought, do you think there is a risk for Switzerland with Robert Kennedy Jr. declaring war on Big Pharma in the US and really pushing to try to cut costs? That sounds like, given that's one of Switzerland's biggest exports, that could also be a potential danger.
Yeah, the most important export to the United States is indeed pharmaceutical products for Switzerland, and that means access to that market is crucial. And most importantly, the ability to set prices in that market is crucial. Unlike, for example, the European market, pharmaceutical prices are not strictly regulated in the United States, which is why pharmaceutical companies make most of their money in the United States. That is something any U.S. administration could change. And, Kennedy, if in office, could institute some new legislation. But what we've seen under the Biden administration is that for the first time, several pharmaceutical products were actually regulated in terms of the price. And that is a risk. So in some sense, there is a risk that Swiss pharmaceutical companies will lose some of the revenue they currently earn in the United States. It will probably take a little bit of, lobbying effort to make sure that that won't happen. The question is, to some extent, how long the American people will tolerate the fact that effectively they subsidize pharmaceutical products for the rest of the world. that is something that indeed any administration could very much look into. And so, yeah, that is a risk. Whether there is a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, that is something to keep in mind.
Now, I wanted to ask you a bit about debt and countries' debt. And it's something which I've always struggled to wrap my head around, and that is the implications of countries with large amounts of debt, because it seems like debt for most countries just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you have these extreme cases like Greece and Italy where the debt to GDP ratio is well above 100. What is the limit to how much debt a country can sustain before finally facing serious consequences?
Well, in principle, a country can borrow as long as it wants. There is no limit, as long as you have someone to buy all of these government bonds. That's how government runs a deficit and finances a deficit. It basically borrows the money by issuing a bond, the government bond. Now, typically, these bonds are auctioned off and financial institutions typically buy them. Now, they buy them at a certain price, and that price will reflect how risky the bond is, how likely is it that the government might not pay back. Typically, there is no risk. Nobody expects that France will default or the United States will default. So there's very little risk, but there can be risk. And we've seen that recently with Greece, that there was indeed a concern that if you buy that government bond, which promise you some money to be paid in the future, that you might not see that money. Then, of course, the interest rates go up. And that means for government that it's very expensive to borrow money. It has to borrow money at a very high interest rate. And if you already have a lot of debt and the interest rates go up, then eventually just the interest payments will consume much of your budget. So any government has a certain budget, that's the tax revenue. The question is, how much of that tax revenue do you have to spend on interest payments? And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that because of rising interest rates and because of the very high levels of debt in various countries, the interest payments have gone up a lot. And that is a problem because eventually you have a very tough decision to make because you spend more on interest payments and you're already running a deficit. That means you probably have to cut spending somewhere else, maybe on welfare spending, maybe on the military, maybe on investments. And so that's when countries run into trouble. Of course, there's still no risk of default to the extent that you have a central bank, which in theory can print money and buy your bonds. But that, of course, would undermine the value of the currency. So there is a limit, but it's not precise where that limit is. It depends a little bit on what country we're talking about.
Well, if we keep it within the EU, what impact does a country's debt like Greece have on the rest of the EU? My understanding is there is some kind of balance within the European Union, so some better performing countries would help balance out the underperforming ones in terms of managing their money. Is that right?
Well, we shouldn't forget the lessons of the Euro crisis 10 years ago, or, rather 12 years ago. I want to take the peak. The problem was that prior to the financial crisis, prior to 2007, 2008, all the members of the European Union, all the members of the Euro area, all of the governments that borrowed money could borrow at the same interest rate because there was no perceived risk of default. And it was always clear that they now issue these bonds in the same currency. So there was no difference in the interest rate that these countries had to pay on their debt. But then, starting with the financial crisis and the fact that countries had to run large deficits to support their economies, there was indeed a perceived risk that a country like Greece and later Italy and Spain, that they would not service their debt. They would not pay back. And that led to the situation that the interest rates on these bonds surged. In the case of Greece, all the way up to 40%, which then, of course, is no longer sustainable. So in the case of Greece, you actually saw a haircut. Some of the debt was actually not paid back, and you saw a little bit of a bailout. But in the case that was much more important, much more worrying than Greece, in the case of Italy and Spain, you saw something very different. Because Greece was never really that important. If Greece defaults, it's not a very big country. It's not a huge amount of bonds. But everyone would understand that if Greece doesn't pay back, who's next? So the danger of the euro crisis was that it's spreading from one country to the next. And the next one could be a very big one, like Italy and Spain. And so what happened in the summer of 2012 is that the interest rates of Spain and Italy went up to 6 and 7%, to a level that these countries would not be able to afford. And that was the moment when the former president of the European Central Bank made a very important speech, the famous "whatever it takes" speech. He essentially figured out the problem. The problem was that every country in the euro area effectively borrows money in euros, but it cannot print euros. So you're basically borrowing money in a currency that your country cannot print. So you can actually default. It's very different from the United States or Switzerland. We have our own currency. So we ever have trouble to pay back our debt, we just print the money. That was perceived as not possible for countries in the euro area. And so what Mario Draghi famously said in his "whatever it takes" speech is, no, 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 no. They are not borrowing in a foreign currency. If necessary, we will basically print the money and buy these bonds. So there's no risk of default. And so within the euro area, it has been made clear that this kind of risk, the risk of a sovereign default, is not there, because if push comes to shove, the ECB, the European Central Bank, will buy these bonds. And so there's no risk of losing your money. The only risk you have if you give your money to a government in the euro area is that you are paid back with euros, which will be worth less than they are today, because new money has been printed.
Who controls inflation in Europe? So the European Central Bank is the one who decides if euros can be printed?
Yes, yeah, pretty much. Who controls inflation? Well, in principle, it's the mandate of the European Central Bank. The question is whether they can control it and whether they want to. And what we've seen over the last 25 years is something quite extraordinary, that when the European Central Bank was actually founded and the euro was created, Article 127 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union says that the ECB's mandate is price stability. Now, if you ask anyone, on the street, what does price stability mean? It means 0% inflation. But the European Central Bank, over time, interpreted price stability as something between 0 and 2%. Then they aimed for something just below 2%. Then they aimed for 2% on average. And if you look at the most recent statements, it's unclear what they're actually aiming for. So who's in charge of controlling inflation? Well, it's the mandate of the European Central Bank, but increasingly it has walked away from that mandate.
Switzerland has quite a well-balanced budget, well, at least compared to the rest of Europe. Why is that? Why is that debt so much lower?
Well, part of it might be the debt brake that was introduced about 20 years ago. So it's basically in the constitution that the country cannot run large deficits. That certainly helps because it's a mechanism that forces politicians to spend less money. There's always an incentive for policymakers to spend money. And I'm not criticizing them. because policymakers, they have to win elections every couple of years, and the public simply wants to have more spending. All of us have a wish list. Christmas is coming up. We all would like to have, you name it. Some want to have more spending on, education. Some want to have more spending on infrastructure. Some want to have more spending on the military. So there's an endless demand on the government to spend money, but there's very little appetite among the voters to pay taxes. And so there is a sort of an ingrained imbalance. The voters want more spending, but they don't want to pay for it. So essentially, politicians are asked to run a deficit. And so in some sense, it helps them that in Switzerland, the politicians have an institutional barrier to run this deficit. And so whenever they come together, they say, yeah, we would like to spend more, but we're not allowed to. And that's currently the discussion you have. But you see how hard it is for policymakers to then decide where not to spend that much. So that is part of the reason why Switzerland has a relatively low debt.
That's it for part 1. Part 2 will be out soon, so keep an eye out for it. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe or follow button. It really helps the show and will also notify you when part 2 is out. Also, if you haven't already, check out the new website, howitticks.ch, where you will find episode details, links, transcript, and a place to share your feedback. I would love to hear from you. See you in part 2.